She built a shelter beneath the woodshed until the coldest week shattered everything. The first snow of November came on a Thursday, and Maren Karlstad stood at the kitchen window watching it fall, the way she always did, with her coffee going cold in her hand and her mind somewhere far away from the warm house behind her. She was 41 years old, and she had lived on this land for 12 of those years, ever since her husband Dale had brought her out to his family's property in the high country of northern Montana, where the mountains pressed in from 3 sides, and the nearest town was 40 minutes down a road that turned treacherous in winter. She had learned to love it eventually. The silence, the wildness, the way the sky at night was so thick with stars, it seemed to bow down under the weight of them. She had learned to love all of it except for the cold, which arrived each year like an old enemy she had no choice but to negotiate with. Dale had died 2 years ago. A cardiac event, the doctor called it, the kind of phrasing that felt too clinical for the fact of a man here one moment and gone the next, leaving behind a half-finished woodpile and a marriage of 10 years and a daughter who was 8 years old, and suddenly very quiet in ways she had never been before. Maren had stayed on the property because leaving felt like erasing something she wasn't ready to erase, and because Lily loved the land in her bones the way children love places they've grown up in before they know how to question whether they should, and because, if she was being honest with herself, she didn't know where else she would go. She had gotten good at the practical things. She could split wood now, cords of it every autumn, stacking it under the long woodshed that ran along the north side of the property where a stand of ponderosa pines offered some shelter from wind. She had learned to bank the fire at night and check the pipes when temperatures dropped below 20, to keep the truck plugged in and the pantry stocked deep from October through March. She had become, in other words, a woman who managed. People in town admired her for it in that particular way people admire things they are relieved not to have to do themselves. What she had not managed in 2 years was to pay very much attention to the woodshed's foundation, which is how she came to discover, one morning in early November when she went out to bring in an armful of pine, that something was living under it. The woodshed sat on concrete piers, and there was a gap of maybe 14 inches between the shed's floor joists and the cold ground beneath. The space was enclosed on 3 sides by rough wooden skirts Dale had nailed in years ago to keep out the wind, but the 4th side, facing south, was open. Maren had never thought much about it. She crouched now in the fresh snow, her breath clouding, and looked into the dimness beneath the shed at the small nest that had been constructed there with a thoroughness that surprised her. Dry grass and shredded bark, pine needles, a strip of what looked like insulating foam torn from somewhere, and curled in the center of it, very still, a dog, not a wild dog, or at least not originally. She could see that even in the dim light. The animal was some kind of shepherd mix, medium sized, with a rough tawny coat, and one ear that stood upright and one that folded. It was thin in the way that spoke of weeks of poor eating, its hip bones pronounced, its ribs visible through the fur even from a distance. It looked at her with amber eyes that were watchful but not panicked, and it did not move. "Hey," Maren said, because she didn't know what else to say. The dog watched her. She went inside and got a piece of leftover chicken from the refrigerator and brought it back out and set it just inside the opening, then stepped away. She stood in the cold for 10 minutes until the dog crept forward with the slow and deliberate care of an animal that has learned to be cautious about gifts, and took the chicken and retreated back into its nest. She didn't tell Lily that day. She wanted to think first, to figure out what she was dealing with. That evening she drove into town and went to the feed store and described the dog to a man named Curtis, who knew most of what there was to know about animals in the valley, and he shook his head and Said there'd been reports of a dog running loose out near the old Haverson place since September. Somebody's pet gone feral, maybe, or abandoned, he said, and then added the obvious thing about how it wouldn't survive the winter out there, and Maren said she knew that. She told Lily that night after dinner. Lily, who at 10 had developed the focused intensity that grief sometimes plants in children, listened without expression until Maren was finished describing the dog, and then said, "Can we keep it?" "We don't know if it's going to let us," Maren said. "It's been living wild for a while. It might be too scared. I can make it not scared," Lily said, with the kind of confidence that is either foolish or prescient depending on how things turn out. She let Lily come out the next morning and watched her daughter crouch in the snow at the opening of the woodshed space with a patience that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Lily didn't call to the dog or try to reach in. She just sat, her breath making small clouds in the air, and every few minutes she would set a piece of food an inch or two further inside the opening and wait. The dog watched her from its nest for a long time, then slowly, with that same deliberate caution, it shifted and crept a little closer. "Mom," Lily breathed, not looking away. "Mom, look." "I see," Maren said softly. Over the following 2 weeks, Lily brought the dog forward 1 careful inch at a time. She named it Birch, after the pale trees along the creek, before it had come within arm's reach. She sat in the snow every morning and every afternoon, and Maren brought her out hot chocolate and a folded wool blanket to sit on, and said nothing about the cold because she understood that some things matter more than comfort. The dog began to take food from Lily's outstretched palm. Then one afternoon it allowed her to touch its head, just once, briefly, before pulling back. Lily came inside that day with her cheeks red and her eyes shining, and said nothing to her mother at dinner, but kept smiling into her soup. Maren had done her own observing during these weeks. She had noticed the way the dog had constructed its shelter with more intelligence than she might have expected, how it had positioned the bulk of the nesting material against the north side where the wind came through, how it had found pieces of material that offered real insulation. There was something in the animal's self-sufficiency that she found unexpectedly moving, a creature that had been set adrift from the world it was built for and had responded by building something new. She thought about that more than she wanted to admit. She put out a proper dog bed on the 3rd week, sliding it under the shed's overhang, just inside the opening. The dog used it that first night. She put out a water bowl that she swapped out twice a day when it froze. She put out food in regular portions, and the dog ate it all, every time, and started to put a little weight back on. She still hadn't tried to bring it inside. Something told her that needed to happen on the dog's own timeline, not hers. The first week of December arrived with temperatures in the teens and a wind that cut through everything. Maren reinforced the wooden skirts around the woodshed base with extra boards and stuffed the cracks with insulating foam from the hardware store. She was not prepared for what happened next, which was a weather forecast that stopped her cold. She heard it on the radio Tuesday evening while she was making dinner. A weather system moving down from Canada, they said, of a kind that hadn't hit the valley in over a decade. Temperatures dropping to -30 by Thursday, possibly lower, with wind chills pushing -50 or beyond. The kind of cold that killed engines and split pipes and could kill an animal living in an unheated space overnight. She stood at the stove and listened to the forecast finish, and then she turned off the burner and went to the window and looked out toward the woodshed, which was a dark shape against the darker trees. She thought about that dog in its nest. -30. It might survive it with a good enough shelter, might, if the dog was as clever about staying alive as it had shown itself to be, or it might not. There was no ambiguity in margin she was working with. She went out that night with a flashlight. Birch watched her from the nest without moving. Maren crouched at the opening and looked in and said, quietly, "Okay. I need you to help me out here." The dog's one upright ear moved forward. Its amber eyes reflected the flashlight's beam. "There's a cold coming that you can't handle out here. I need you to come inside." She didn't know why she explained it. Force of habit, maybe, of talking to Lily, of believing that what you said out loud had some effect on the shape of things. She went inside and got a piece of roast beef from the refrigerator and went back out and crouched again. She held it out. The dog looked at it for a long time. Then it got up out of its nest, slowly, and came forward. It took the food from her hand, so close now that she could feel the warmth of its breath on her palm, could see the roughness of its coat up close, and the long white scar along one shoulder that told some story she would never know. It looked at her. She stood and stepped back toward the house and said, "Come on," quietly, just once. Then she turned and went to the back door and opened it and waited. She stood in the cold for 5 minutes, and she was about to give up and think of something else when she heard the soft pad of footsteps in the snow and turned to see Birch standing 6 feet away, looking at the open door with its ears both forward now, its whole body a question. "It's okay," Marin said. The dog walked past her and into the house. She stood there a moment longer, looking out at the dark and the trees and the sky pressing down with its weight of coming weather, and then she went inside and closed the door. She left Birch in the kitchen overnight with the dog bed from under the shed, figuring familiar smells might help. In the morning she found the dog curled on the bed exactly as she'd left it. When Lily came downstairs in her pajamas and stopped in the kitchen doorway and saw, her face went through something complicated and private. And then she crossed the kitchen and sat down on the floor next to the dog and put her arms around it, with the careful ease of someone picking up something fragile, and Birch pressed its face into her neck, and neither of them moved for a long time. The cold came as predicted. Wednesday night. Temperature began to drop, and by Thursday morning it was at -22 and still falling. Marin left the faucets running to a thin trickle and kept the wood stove burning steadily through day and night, feeding it every few hours. She moved firewood from the woodshed to the porch in the morning before the worst of it hit, carrying armful after armful while her breath crystallized in her beard and the cold made her eyes water, and her exposed skin went from aching to burning. By the time she finished, she couldn't feel her feet even through the insulated boots, and she stood inside the back door for 10 minutes just warming her hands around a mug of tea. By Thursday afternoon it was -31. She checked the thermometer every hour with a kind of grim fascination. Truck wouldn't start despite the block heater, which meant they were not going anywhere, and she was glad she had thought to fill the pantry and the propane tank earlier in the week. She called her neighbor Ellen, 12 miles away, who was fine and had power, and told Marin to call if anything went wrong. She called Lily's school and confirmed what she already knew, that it was closed through Friday at least. Lily spent most of those days on the floor with Birch, reading or drawing or just sitting, with the dog pressed against her side. She fed it and talked to it in a low, constant murmur that Marin could hear from the next room without making out the words, the particular frequency of a child in earnest conversation with a creature that couldn't talk back. Marin found herself standing in the doorway at odd moments, watching them, holding her coffee. She was aware of something shifting in the house, some quality of the air, like a room that's been closed off for a long time and is finally being let to breathe. On Friday night, the coldest night, the temperature hit -38. Marin checked the thermometer at 2 in the morning and stood at the window, looking out at the woodshed, and thought about the nest Birch had built under there, how carefully arranged it had been, how deliberately constructed with whatever the dog had been able to find. 8 foot of snow lay on the ground, and the sky was entirely clear, and stars burned with a hard, bright intensity that seemed almost aggressive. And she stood there in the dark kitchen in her wool socks, and felt the cold pressing against the windows like something that wanted in. She thought about Dale, which she tried not to do too often because it still had the power to knock the floor out from under her. She thought about the morning he had brought her out here the first time, before they were married, and how she had stood in this same yard in a different season and looked at the mountains and thought they were the most terrifying and beautiful things she had ever seen. She thought about how he had said, without any drama, that this was where he was supposed to be, and how she had found herself believing it not long after. She thought about how the land had become her land too, and how grief had not changed that, had maybe even deepened it, the way the roots of trees go deeper in rocky soil. Birch padded into the kitchen and sat beside her, its warm weight pressing against her leg, and she looked down at it and then back out the window. "It's going to be all right," she said, not entirely sure who she was talking to. The cold broke on Saturday. Not suddenly, not warmly, but the thermometer crept up through the day, and by evening it was back at -10, and then by Sunday afternoon it was in the single positives, and Monday morning it was at 15 degrees, which after the week they had felt almost mild. Maren went outside and stood in the yard and breathed the air and felt her shoulders drop from around her ears. She walked to the woodshed and crouched down and looked under it out of something she couldn't name, gratitude, maybe, or a need to see the place that had begun all of this. The nest was still there, slightly flattened by time, its careful arrangements still visible. The dog bed she had first put there was frozen to the ground. She looked at it for a while and thought about the months Birch had been out here alone, building and waiting, surviving things she hadn't witnessed and didn't know. She went back inside and found Lily in the living room with the dog, a book open in her lap, Birch's head resting on her knee. Lily looked up with a question in her face. "I was just looking at the woodshed," Maren said. "Are we going to patch it up?" Lily asked. "Like, board it up all the way around?" Maren looked at her daughter for a moment. "Probably should." "Birch doesn't need it any more," Lily said, in a tone that was both factual and quietly satisfied. "No," Maren agreed, "she doesn't." She stood in the living room doorway and looked at the two of them, her daughter and this animal that had appeared out of the wilderness and built itself a life under their woodshed, and waited until someone came close enough to let it in. She thought about all the things that persist quietly in the cold, waiting. The way the creek froze on the surface but kept running underneath all winter, too stubborn or too necessary to stop entirely. The way the grass came back every spring from roots that had survived things no one had been watching. She sat down in the chair across from Lily and picked up her own book, and Birch's tail thumped once against the floor without the dog raising its head, and the fire popped and settled in the stove, and outside the cold held its position but no longer felt like an enemy so much as a fact, something that had always been here and would keep being here, something you learned to live alongside rather than against. That afternoon she called the vet in town and made an appointment for the following week, and called Ellen to tell her the story because Ellen would want to know, and Ellen laughed when she heard about the nest under the woodshed and said, "Smart dog." And Maren said yes, very smart, and realized she was smiling in a way she hadn't in longer than she could account for. The snow kept coming that winter, as it always did, storm after storm rolling down from the north and blanketing the property in deep white silence that muffled everything and made the world feel both small and infinite at once. Maren split wood and fed the stove and kept the truck running and did all the things she had learned to do. And every evening she sat in the living room with her daughter and the dog and the fire. And something that had been pulled tight in her chest for 2 years was slowly, carefully letting go. She thought sometimes about the shelter Birch had built, the intelligence of it, the care, the way the animal had chosen a spot that offered something a partial protection, a roof of sorts, proximity to warmth without direct access to it, and had worked with what it found to make it better than it had been. There was no sentimentality in that calculation, just necessity and cleverness and the pure determination to get through. She thought she understood that. In March, when the first real thaw came and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to pull back to reveal the brown pressed grass underneath, Maren went out to the woodshed one morning and began to board up the open side properly, closing off the gap that had sheltered the dog through the fall. She worked slowly, measuring and cutting and nailing, her breath still clouding in the cold but the air carrying in it the first faint suggestion of something else, something that smelled like mud and water and the cold, sweet green of things beginning to emerge. Birch sat a few feet away and watched her work with a calm, proprietary air, as if supervising the management of property that had once been hers. "You're not upset about this?" Marin asked, fitting a board. The dog's upright ear swiveled. "Good." Marin said, "You've been promoted." Interior office. She finished the work by mid-morning and stood back and looked at the clothes, doff woodshed, and felt satisfied in the thorough, bodily way that good physical work produces. She looked out at the property, the trees, the snow-streaked slope behind the house, the mountains whose tops were still white against a sky going blue and wide and open. She had stood in this yard so many times in so many seasons, and the yard was the same, and she was not the same, and she was learning that those two things could both be true, and neither one had to undo the other. She called to Birch, and the dog came readily, brushing against her leg, and she put her hand on its head for a moment, feeling the rough warmth of the animal's skull under her palm. Then she went inside, into the warmth where her daughter was. The winter finished, as all winters do, not with a dramatic conclusion but with a slow recession, snow pulling back from the fields and the yard, and finally from the north-facing slope behind the pines, the creek running high with melt, the mornings coming lighter. Marin made it through, which was what she had been doing for 2 years, but she was beginning to think that making it through was not quite the same as living, and that the difference between the two was something worth paying attention to. She was 41 years old, and there was a long road still, and a daughter who was learning to be brave by watching her, and a dog who had taught them both something about shelter, what it means, and what it costs, and what it looks like when you build it with your own hands from whatever you can find. And sometimes in the evenings, when the fire was low and Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, Marin would sit in the lamplight with Birch at her feet and the cold pressing gently at the windows, and she would feel, not happiness exactly, but something more durable than happiness, something with the weight and texture of ground beneath it, holding,